for joining us. Before we get started this evening, I just wanted to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be available on our Facebook, YouTube, and on our website after today. I'm just going to give everyone a few more minutes to join, and then we will get started. All righty, let's see, it's 6:01. I'll give it till 6:02, and then we'll get started. Okay, it's 6:02. Anyone else can certainly join us as we go. So welcome back, everyone, to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series talking about race matters. Join the conversation. My name is Meredith Horsford, and I'm the executive director here at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We are delighted to continue this lecture series. As many of you know, and many of you already attended, this is a series that we started last year in August of 2020. And it was so successful that we've decided to bring it back. We had our second iteration of the lecture series in February of this year, and here we are now in our third. So thank you so much for those of you who have returned, and welcome to those who are here for the first time. This is a 5-week series that centers around reestablishing sites, introducing an inclusive narrative to cultural and educational institutions. Each week we will be hearing from a different speaker, or in this case, speakers, from various fields, including historic sites, art, archaeology, and preservation, followed by a question and answer session. One of the most important topics throughout history, and certainly in recent years, is the topic of race. Race influences our lives historically and in the present, which is the reason that we began this lecture series last summer. We at the Farmhouse feel that it is important to have and to facilitate conversations about race, even though they are sometimes challenging. Our goal for this conversation is to encourage everyone to come together, learn from one another, and continue the conversation. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out a few Zoom features for everyone. Please use the chat box, which I see you're using already, to say hello to other attendees and to ask Melissa, our Director of Development and Community Engagement, if you have any technical assistance questions. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please click the Q&A button and we will answer those questions for you towards the end. We also just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We feel strongly that our programming remains free of charge so that it is accessible to all. So in the response to this lecture series has been overwhelming, and there's clearly a need for us to talk about the issues that divide us and the issues that unite us as Americans. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support these programs. This event is made possible by funding from the New York Community Trust. We are grateful for their contribution that has assisted us in the continued success of this series. This fall 2021 series is also sponsored by the Bowery Residence Committee, or BRC for short. We have worked closely with BRC and community members over the last year to bring awareness to the Inwood African burial ground that sits between 211th and 212th Street on 10th Avenue in our neighborhood of Inwood. This is also the potential new site for a BRC shelter for people experiencing homelessness. To learn more about BRC's important work and community efforts, head to the link that is posted in the chat. If you would like to make a donation to help us to continue our community-focused programming, it is greatly appreciated. Additionally, we are selling t-shirts that highlight the names of the enslaved and free people that lived and worked at the farmhouse on the front, and it says "say their names" on the back. We also featured last week at our lecture series for the first time a second shirt that we've put together, which you can see on the bottom right of your screen, which really speaks to our partnership with our lecture speakers from last week, the I Was Here project. So these QR codes will take you to those pages. And the proceeds for the gray t-shirt that you see on your screen support our partnership with the I Was Here project. Tonight, we are joined by 4 panelists presenting Markers on the Land, Slavery, Commemoration, and the History of Africans in Northern Manhattan. Our speakers tonight will be Dr. Robert W. Snyder, Manhattan Borough Historian and Professor Emeritus of American Studies and Journalism at Rutgers University, Newark. Peggy King-Yorda, Cultural Projects Consultant and Global Expert. Dr. Andrea Mosterman, Associate Professor in History at the University of New Orleans, and Dr. Richard Tomczak, Professor and Proposal Development Coordinator at Stony Brook University. With changes contemplated for an African burial ground and Native American ritual site in Inwood, Rob Snyder is going to lead us tonight on a panel discussion on the history of slavery at the Dyckman Farmhouse in New Amsterdam and in the early years of the United States. How might we best study this past and commemorate it in the present? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our panelists, Dr. Robert Snyder, Peggy King-Yorda, Dr. Andrea Mosterman, and Dr. Richard Tomczak. And first, we'll give it over to Richard to give us a brief introduction to Inwood.
Thanks, Meredith, and thanks for the introduction, and welcome everybody. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and I just have a brief presentation just to get us oriented a little bit with the different time periods that we're going to be talking about today in our roundtable, and what New York looked like in each of those different stages. I think it's important to start off with stating that similar to most of the colonial North, New York was plugged into the transatlantic slave trade that forcefully relocated 12.5 million West Africans to the New World. Coerced into working for Southern planters and Northern urban craftsmen alike, the enslaved people that came to the Americas did so against their will. In the North, 2 major auction sites served as the western endpoints of the Middle Passage. Planters in the Hudson Valley purchased slaves from Newport, Rhode Island, and the auction site located on the East River in New York City. Slavery in New York originated from the first European settlers on Manhattan Island. In 1626, the Dutch founded the trading post of New Amsterdam, pictured here, near the southern tip of the island, and established a small permanent settlement to house the families of the Dutch West India Company. Pictured here is the modest Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, which was a commercially oriented seaport, largely based on trade with the indigenous communities in the imperial borderlands of the colonial Northeast. And we'll hear much more from Andrea about New Netherland and New Amsterdam. During the 18th century, British New York did see the city grow and the demand for labor with it. After conquering New Amsterdam in 1664, the English renamed the colony New York and seized control over the pre-existing population. By the early 18th century, New York City and its environs composed one of the largest and most important seaports in British North America. On the left here, we can start to see the urban seaport sprawl a little bit further than or grow a little bit further where it was as New Amsterdam. Start to look a little bit more recognizable as streets are put onto a grid system. And on the right is Upper Manhattan. So today, where Kingsbridge is located on this map is where the borough of Manhattan ends and the Bronx would begin. And this is right where the community, the modern day community of Inwood is located, and the Dyckman Farmhouse. This is also drawn. This is also from an American Revolutionary era map, which is why there are Hessian posts located just to the south there. Finally, this last map that I have to orient us geographically depicts Manhattan Island as it starts to look a little more familiar to us. The 19th century city is sprawling north up the island, and the street grid system is projected on the terrain. All the way up to the north, however, the location of Inwood still remained primarily rural in character. To indicate that, I've put a rectangle around where Inwood would be located and the Dyckman farmhouse. Going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit on that. Okay, so the top rectangle indicates where the Dyckman farmhouse was located and is located today still. During the 19th century, still operating on the agricultural cycle. And just below that is the location of the Inwood slave burial ground. And I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rob to start the discussion.
Meredith and Richard, thanks for those opening remarks. They got us launched really well. I want to now just ask a few questions to our panelists that'll get a conversation going, and then later on we'll move on to engage questions from all the folks who are with us. So we'll start on the most specific questions about Northern Manhattan and Inwood and the lives of Africans there, and then we'll move out into larger regional and even global contexts. Richard, your research on the Dyckman House and the enslaved people who lived there has taken what you describe as a generational approach. What does that involve, and what are the benefits of that?
Yeah, I think from the outset, Meredith and the Dyckman farmhouse and myself, once we had the body of research completed, we wanted to tell the stories of the enslaved people that worked and were bonded to the Dyckman family. And because Jan Dyckman comes over to, migrates to the New World, or to New Amsterdam in the 1660, I believe, we found it the best approach to take a big picture and look at how each generation of enslaved individuals would have lived under the Dutch, the British, and then finally independent American government. Because each different group that occupied New York had different law codes, the definitions of freedom would have been constantly changing as people adapted to what those legal restrictions would have looked like and the institutions that enforce them. The generational approach then not only allows us to tell more of the stories of individuals themselves and the families that they and the communities that they cultivated in New York, but also the way that they adapted and adopted the culture of each of those different groups.
So you get a story of change over time in some ways too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Andrea, you visited Dyckman House and you've looked very carefully as a researcher at how the Dutch and Africans inhabited the homes and workplaces of New Netherland and Dutch New York. What have you learned about their lives in and around places like Dyckman House?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. I look forward to this conversation. I totally agree with what Richard is saying, that it's very important to think of it as generational. And so he's pointing out like different laws that are changing, but also when we look at actually the way these houses are organized and where enslaved people work and live changes progressively over time as well. And I think that there's a more systematic way of thinking about where one would actually house their enslaved laborers, where they would place their living spaces. So whereas initially in the 17th century, we see more often that enslaved people are living in closer quarters to the people who enslaved them, progressively over the course of the 18th century, we see that there are separate spaces they are inhabiting, and those are often, of course, the kitchens that are often in New York, cellar kitchens or outdoor kitchens. And then the garret spaces, like you see at the lot house, for example, or attics in some cases. That becomes more more prominent over the course of the 18th century, where we really see that slavery has become so integral to New York society that even when organizing their spaces, the enslavers would think about, where do we house these people? Where do we locate their labor? And so forth. And this is something I believe you can also see at the Dyckman House.
What does that process that you observe represent? Is it a kind of tightening of the bonds of domination? Is it an attempt to distance themselves from the people who labor for them? How would you interpret that?
There's so much going on there. And you actually see similar changes in, for example, Virginia. So we see, when we look at the spaces, we see very similar developments in other places. One of it is that there's more emphasis throughout the 18th century on privacy and private space. And that is where enslaved people would be more often separated from the spaces that their enslavers inhabit. It's also more part of the increasing kind of a culture of the elites, to actually, have this very clean, open space, and then more the clutter of the work, the labor toward the back of the home or below the home. So there's a lot of different things that are going on there that actually attribute to those changes over the course of the 18th century and then starting in the late 17th century. But those would be some of them. And of course, the houses become bigger as well. So, if you take the one-room houses that were so common that we see, for example, with the lot house, that's how the lot house in what today is Brooklyn, New York started. It's very different from Schuyler Mansion, which was this huge mansion built in the 1760s. So there's also a difference in the spaces that these people are actually living in.
So in some ways, as enslavers get more prosperous and better grounded on the land, they try to hide their enslaved laborers more. They try to put distance between themselves and the people whose labor undergirds their prosperity.
In some ways, it's a manicured version of it, right? So it's still very much visible, but it's very very selective in what is visible to the outside and what is hidden more below or behind the homes.
It's really interesting. Peggy, for more than 30 years, from the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan to the South Atlantic today, you've been an advocate for marginalized histories and burial grounds. What's the importance of this work, and what led you to work on the Inwood African burial site?
I'd say that the importance of the work, just at the outside, given the fact that the African American community was traditionally not a part of the historic discourse on memory, that the work that I do with people and with organizations or developers who are impacting sites like burial grounds, the work is really about giving the community an opportunity to stake the right of recognition and inclusion. It also is an opportunity to confront the deficiencies that we have in the overall historical narrative and how it is that we talk about or we include Black life and its relevance in the American and the global context. And then the work in itself, for me, is important. The opportunity to work with organizations like BRC and others who impact these kinds of sites or who are proposing to impact these sites in some way, and helping to guide their efforts to prioritize the site significance, to engage the community in a meaningful way, and really to understand what we're really talking about in terms of restorative justice, because so many of these sites have been impacted by development over the years, and whether knowingly or unknowingly. And so what we've learned so much at the end of the day, what we've learned from the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan that many people know, which is the only national historic monument to an African cemetery, an African burial ground, is that public engagement is key. Public engagement also supported with political action, and that both of those two things have to go together. So working with community, working with the developers or the entities that may impact these sites, that's critical. That is critical. And that's the importance of the work, because at the end of the day, we want to be able to define how it is that we're going to tell this history through places and spaces.
And what pulled you up to Inwood on this specific project here?
Well, what pulled me up to Inwood is BRC's, meaning the organization who actually acquired this site, or was in the process of acquiring the site, their willingness to want to pause their moving forward with developing the site and really taking a very close look and thoughtful look at the significance of the site, and wanting to do extensive outreach with community, both in the Native American community as well as the descendant community and the local community. As well, what makes this site unique, and it, aside from the fact that you have a potential developer who is willing to embrace the significance of this site, which is incredibly, it's unusual, but that you have an organization that is uniquely taking a look at its own clientele, to say that we understand what a marginalized community is all about. We are in the business of supporting and hosting those who are experiencing homelessness and are marginalized, oftentimes marginalized community within our larger community. So that Inwood site is again part of overall New York's story of African presence. And oftentimes people forget that what was happening uptown was also happening downtown, and that these things are connected.
All of you, have done so much interesting work. Let me just follow up with a few questions, and then I'll sort of open it up to crosstalk among you. Richard, one of the things you pointed out is that the people who were enslaved at Dyckman House straddled urban and rural worlds. Could you say more about that and what that would have meant in their lives over the years?
Yeah, and I would love to hear Andrea and Peggy's interpretation as well, because I do think that, and Meredith and I have talked about this as well, something that makes the Dyckman farmhouse and the enslaved people that lived there and worked for the family would have made their situation unique. Or perhaps I think maybe analogous to what's happening in the Hudson River Valley as well. But because the day-to-day rhythms of life for the enslaved people that worked on the Dyckman farm were dominated by the agricultural seasons, the planting, tending the crops, harvesting, and then the downtime in the winter month and the tasks that running a farm would encompass. So the day-to-day rhythm might be agricultural or rural, but because of the location and its close proximity to the expanding seaport under the British and then eventually an independent American government, they would have been extremely familiar with the daily routines of the more urban life as well, and directly connected to it, not just familiar with it, but the road from New York City ran through the Dyckman, or right adjacent to the Dyckman property, over the Free Bridge or the King's Bridge. So going north into the Hudson Valley. So merchants traveling by country cart would have passed right by and would have stopped in the taverns in the modern day area of Inwood. Sloops and schooners traveling up the Hudson River would have been transporting goods from all over the world, which would have made the enslaved people who lived at the Dyckman property cosmopolitan in their ability to navigate both of these urban and rural worlds. And I think that part of this too just comes from the way in which we interpret history as well. I think that rightfully in its early stages, the history of slavery in New York focused on the urban components because it was divergent from the southern plantations, the large scale plantations of the South. And since then, it's been expanding to the history of the Hudson River Valley, like Andrea's work, and the history of slavery on Long Island. And I think that the straddling of urban and rural is really what makes this unique from a historical perspective.
Now, did that state of life along the urban and rural divide have any impact with regard to enslaved people's struggles for autonomy or even attempts to escape to freedom?
A really good question. The evidence that we've seen is that it did directly impact it. So I have no doubt that the enslaved people that worked for the Dyckmans in the early 19th century would have been familiar with developments in early abolition movements and emancipation, like the Free School in New York, which would have been, there also would have been newspapers circulating around the region as well, even though not directly connected to the urban settlement. So they would have been very much in touch with what was taking place there. We also know from manumission records that we have that the Dyckmans eventually manumitted or freed their slaves based on, as far as we can tell, motivations of the abolitionist movement or motivations of humanity, as they put it in the record. So it would have directly impacted, the changing definitions of freedom would have directly impacted the way in which they lived their lives.
So their lives are both quite local, but also more regional and global in a lot of ways. I mean, that's one of the interesting things that strikes me. And along the same vein, Andrea, what was the significance of the Dutch Reformed Church in the life of the Dutch and enslaved Africans?
That's a huge question. But I think one of the things so first of all, the Dutch Reformed Church was very important to Dutch American culture, like especially when we look at these smaller communities that continue to speak the Dutch language for a long time, sometimes into the 19th century, that continued Dutch culture in some modified way. In America, the Dutch Reformed Church was really central to those communities. So those are places like Kingston or Brooklyn, Albany. And what we see is that when it comes to slavery and the lives of enslaved people, one of the things that we see happening in the similar way that we saw that with the homes is that whereas in the 17th century, enslaved Africans are actually participating in the Dutch Reformed Church. They marry in the church, they have their children baptized in the church. Over the course of the 18th century, in a lot of these local communities, that becomes much less likely. And I believe strongly that is in large part because being part of the church, of that church community, also is increasing your social status within a community. And so to maintain this system of slavery and the hierarchy that is integral to that, we see that fewer enslaved people are actually accepted in these churches, participating in these churches, and more often also physically separated within the buildings if they're even allowed in them. So we see in the 17th century, we see that they are in those churches, especially in New Amsterdam. In the early 18th century, we see that they are in those churches, but not necessarily allowed to participate, but more there to actually help their enslavers, like bringing their foot stoves or, attending to their needs. And then by the latter part of the 18th century, we see more people again accepted in the church, but then they are actually physically separated into oftentimes back seats, either on the first floor or the balcony. And this is the same with the burial grounds, that over time, it becomes more and more common to actually separate and segregate enslaved Africans and not allow them within those burial grounds in these that belong to these Dutch Reformed churches. So there are a few enslaved Africans in late 17th century churches. It's very, very few in the 18th century. Much more common would it be to actually separate them entirely from those spaces.
Yeah, I know in some Protestant denominations and congregations, people of African descent get so fed up with second-class status that they found their own denominations. Is there anything like that in the Dutch Reformed Church with African peoples?
There is one, I believe it was at actually very close to the African burial ground, like the Dwayne Reed area. And I forget now, I'm blanking on the name, Mark Jordan, I believe, was the minister of the first Black Dutch Reformed Church, but it didn't, it wasn't able to survive beyond a few years. In most cases, what we see happening is that these enslaved Africans, African Americans, enslaved New Yorkers really end up attending other denominations when they're not allowed in Dutch Reformed churches. And I do want to emphasize that this was not like a Dutch Reformed Church institutional thing, that they didn't allow Black people or enslaved people in their churches. I think it's much more so on a local level, that it really depends on the community of the congregation actually accepts them. And I have a letter that I found in the archives of Peter Lowe in 1788. He was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Churches, the 6 congregations of Brooklyn. And he actually explicitly mentioned this, the reason why his congregants object when a group of Black men ask to become members in his church, and his own rebuttal to them. He does not agree with these objections. He wants to admit the men, but the objections range from Black people have no souls to they smell bad, I don't want to sit next to them, or if we would admit them, we would look too much like Methodist churches. So there were very much like these very local, objections where you can clearly see that people kind of were thinking of various excuses not to have to allow these people in their churches, when that would mean, if you accept these people as equals before God, and especially the way it works in Dutch Reformed churches, like you all have communion, you're supposed to be all equal at the table. That really challenges then this system that you're all benefiting from.
I'm curious. So what were those ministers' counter arguments? What did he say to his congregation members who objected to him in his plan?
He wanted, when they say that Black people have no souls, he says something along the lines like, it looks like you don't have any, if he calls them he talks about the Pharisees, so he's very much claiming that the Dutch Reformed Church does not have any rules that would not allow these people, and that basically this was that these enslavers themselves, these congregants, basically were not allowing to spread the Dutch Reformed religion as they should have. He actually talks about the spread of Christianity amongst Black people and how that should be an important part of the religion. So those are some of the objections. And I'd be, if anybody wants to read the letter, it is published, and I would be happy to share that information if anybody wants to.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Peggy, you've spoken elsewhere about what you call the weaponization of development. Could you say a bit more about what this is and how we might be able to do better than this in the future?
Before I speak to that, I just want to respond to Andrea. I just recently read something. A gentleman has done some research in Martha's Vineyard relative to the a place called Cottage City, which were these religious camps that would get set up. And they are now finding that there were many Black families or abolitionists who were part of those camps, but historically you just didn't hear about these guys. But one of the things that stuck out was that the abolitionists, who were these religious folk, who were also part of this religious group, they were also recognized as segregationists as well. So when people think in terms of abolitionists, they think it is distinct from, they don't align it with segregation as well. But in fact, many abolitionists were segregationists. So that's just a side note for that. The weaponization of development. It is the work that I do. So much of the biggest challenge with protecting these sites and this history has to do with entities unlike BRC who threaten to impact the site in some adverse way. And so when we talk about that weaponization, I really like to call it a call to action for communities, particularly communities of color in other areas, in rural areas and other towns. New York City, you can kind of create this groundswell of a following to get people's attention, to get behind protecting a site. It's a little bit more difficult in more remote and rural areas. But getting communities to understand or focus on what cities or their local municipalities are doing, how it is that areas get developed, how it is that you challenge your city officials, elected officials, and any other developers or whatever those rules and regulations are in your municipality and how things get built. How is it that you go in and create or galvanize a following to challenge developers or that kind of negative or adverse impact that can potentially erase the history in a town? And by example, I'm working with a group in Noonan, Georgia, where the Confederacy is, that is quite a focus in this town. They have a formal town square. The Confederate soldier sits in the town square. There is a Confederate burial ground, which is a part of the larger cemetery in the town. And from what I understand, having spoken to the sexton of that cemetery, I think the first 3 Black occupants probably were there in 2003 for the first time, or 2007. And there is a cemetery of enslaved and free people. And the community there is now challenged with a state-of-the-art skate park, which occupies 6 acres of what was considered the original acreage, 12 acres of a cemetery that had been reserved, land that had been reserved for a cemetery. So there's a portion that is preserved, but I'm sorry, I had the number wrong. It's 16 acres. And so 12 acres are given over to a skate park. So the community is challenged with getting community folks out, becoming aware of you have the African American Burial Ground Act that's in place, and having to use that as a tool to challenge the city and protect the site in whatever way they can. So again, that's an example. Depending upon what community, where you are, there are different stories and different approaches that you have to engage depending upon what the challenge is, and as for many people understand that downtown in New York, the African Burial Ground, that particular project was a federal development project. And in some other areas, it could be a private developer or other city municipalities building on sites.
You mentioned an African Burial Ground Act. Is that federal legislation, local legislation?
That is federal legislation. I'm forgetting, I think it's the first gentleman, its name is Sherrod. I don't remember the last name, forgive me, but that is federal legislation. And so it is something that certainly that I would encourage various communities. And that I would say is also a challenge. When you talk about smaller communities, it's so much easier in New York City to really get access to foundations and funding and folks who are aware and resources. And it's tougher for smaller communities where those kinds of things are not readily at your fingertips. But that legislation is there to help, various communities throughout the states.
Your comments raise all sorts of ideas in my head, and I suspect that all of you are thinking about new things in light of each other's comments just now. Is there anything anybody wants to add? Just, raise your hand, I'll call on you, and you can chip in and speak to each other's compliments or amplify something that you said earlier. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, I have a question for Peggy, and I think that Andrea can also respond to based on her experience and her research in the Hudson Valley and in New York City. But there's a little bit of a story behind it, but I'll be brief with it. It's a little anecdotal. But recently I went down to visit some friends in Charleston, South Carolina, and they live north of Charleston, or south of Charleston in the Low Country area. So a place that was dominated by rice and indigo plantations in the colonial period. And one of my friends' in-laws actually lives in a housing development called Stono Plantation. And it's very close to Stono Plantation. That's where the initial uprising of enslaved people began as they marched towards the actual seaport and commercial center of Charleston. And I asked him about it because he lived in Charleston now for about 6 years. And the only historical marker that's there is it's kind of off the beaten path. There's no commemoration of it necessarily. And even the family that I was staying with didn't really know the history or the significance of the area. Even though this is a very developed area, you would think there'd be more historical markers for it. And I think that even though I think the same situation might apply in New York, but I'd like to get your guys' input on it of how or what are the best strategies, I guess, to talk about and to make visible the history of enslaved people that lived in New York or in developed areas.
My first response would be, every site is different and there are different circumstances, but certainly I think that what we've learned with the African burial ground downtown is that it's got to be more than a plaque, okay, and it can't be moved. And that for that site, what was really important to the community at large was that there was a sense of permanence of whatever is placed there, whatever the design was, whatever the artwork, the public artwork that got incorporated into the building, that it was critical that there was a sense of permanence, because if you live in New York City, signs disappear. If anything's embedded in a sidewalk, it can be gone tomorrow. But that there needed to be that sense of permanence, and there also needed to be places where there could be engagement, that memorial activities or any kind of activity that would mark and honor the significance of the site was critical in terms of remembrance. And this is an aside to what it is that you guys do, which is relating the story in a way that is much more honest and truthful and forthcoming about the lives of, enslaved people, the reality of enslaved people.
Yeah, Andrea.
Just want to add to that I think that, what Peggy is saying, also there's a real historical symbolism to this, right? That these spaces that were oftentimes, these burial grounds were oftentimes the least valuable lands kind of put away somewhere no markers, or if there was any marker, oftentimes they were not permanent, that there's kind of like a symbolic significance in putting that permanent marker there now, something that, and make it visible, something that when those burial grounds actually were used, when people are actually buried there, they did not get that right? They did not have that opportunity to actually mark it and to make it visible. And so to be able to do that now, I think has a very important meaning as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
More thoughts? Anything any of you wants to add to what's been said just now or earlier?
Something that comes to mind, Richard, when you talked about Charleston, I was recently in Charleston, and again, I'm sorry, the name of the plantation escapes me, but my husband and I were encouraged to go visit this one plantation, and they had a docent who gave a tour, and he's pretty well noted. In fact, people complain about him. And at the start of his talk about this particular plantation, one of the biggest complaints, it was that he really was very, very honest about the history. He talked about the plantation being a forced work labor camp, that's what it was, and and in his words, if you visited another plantation and they failed to tell you that, please ask for your money back, because they weren't talking about the reality of what this place was. And it was a powerful experience walking through this plantation. And of course, the emphasis was not on the building itself or the interior of the building, but some of the revelations that folks gained from, recognizing that columns in front of the plantation were added at a much later period to kind of create a grandness that really did not exist during the time that this family had actually enslaved people, or the brick making, or any of those things. So I found that really, really interesting. And I find I on that occasion, I did visit several plantations. That perhaps was the most powerful to me, whereas others were much more watered down and not as forthcoming about the realities of slavery.
Andrea, yeah.
Just want to add to that. Ed Baptist in The Other Half Has Never Been Told calls these plantations slave labor camps. And I think words matter, right? Like, no, when you visit a plantation, but instead of it being Oak Alley Plantation, I live in New Orleans, these plantations are all around, it would be called Oak Alley Slave Labor Camp. Then obviously you go visit that space with a very different intent and kind of a different a way of even approaching that space, right? So words matter, and markers matter, and commemoration matters. And one thing I think is very important in the case of New York is that people paid more attention to the fact that New York really was not that different from the South. Yes, there was not the plantation system, but when it comes to slavery and the way that enslaved people were controlled and abused and how they lived, oftentimes that did not differ that much. And I think it's important that that's more commonly understood, that we don't talk about it as a different system. It's all slavery, and slavery is always horrible, whether it's in New York or Louisiana.
Right.
Andrea, are there any places in New York State that do a particularly good or bad job of dealing with these issues that we ought to take notice of?
I know that they're doing a lot of work at Phillipsburg Manor, for example. So I think that they would be a really good example of actually addressing the history. Lloyd Manor has been working on this very hard as well.
Where's that?
It's in Long Island. And one of the things that I think in Louisiana, so I live in New Orleans, and in Louisiana, you have the Whitney Plantation, and the Whitney Plantation does a really, really good job with this. And one of the things that they're doing, which is very spatial, which I think is key is that when you visit Whitney Plantation, you actually visit the house, the main house at the end of your tour, and you enter it from the back, not the front. You first go where the enslaved people would have lived. And those, of course, were the majority of the people on those plantations. But in the case of New York, I think that, you know, when you visit a place like Schuyler Mansion, for example, you enter the home and you enter in this big hall with a beautiful staircase and these large, bright rooms. Then you can insert the experience of enslaved people in that narrative, but you don't really see it as they would have seen it, right? Like, not that you could ever see it as they saw it, but even spatially, like you don't see the spaces they would have experienced it, because they never even, some of them would never even have accessed those spaces, or rarely accessed those spaces. They would have gone through that front door. They would have been in the back or in the basement. And so I think that Whitney Plantation is one of these spaces that does a really great job of doing that, and with the memorials as well. And so there are some spaces in New York that are also really working very hard on that. Johnston, I think, is another place. I haven't visited that one, but I think at Johnston House, what's the
Johnson Hall?
Johnston Hall. Yeah, I think they're also really working on integrating the history of slavery on that site. So there are several sites where they're really working hard on doing that.
This is really helpful, but Meredith actually has been watching the chat and the Q&A, and we are building up lots of good questions. So let me hand it over to her, and you can share some of the questions that are bubbling up.
Great, thank you. So there's been a whole slew of activity in the chat and in the Q&A. So I will just dive right in with some of the questions that are kind of geared towards all of you. Anybody jump on in. The first one is for Peggy. Can you tell us what is currently known about the condition of the Inwood African burial ground? Had it been built on previously? Has there been investigation, either non-invasive or invasive, of the site to discover the extent of the surviving burials? How much larger is the burial ground than the lot owned by BRC? And I'm happy to revisit any of that because it was a lot.
Okay, I'll do a broad thing, and if I missed anything. The site, as a part of the requirement on the part of BRC, they were required to do test pits in areas to see whether there was the potential for intact burials. Now, prior to any, and this happens whenever people, archaeologists, think about doing these test pits, doing the initial research, which is to show what has happened on the site up until today. And what has happened and what the record showed was that, even through newspapers and images, was that the site itself had been adversely impacted. Burials were reportedly unearthed, all of them. Some of them, in fact, unceremoniously photographed and put in the newspaper in New York City. But what is not clear is where those remains were reburied. There's no record, as far as we know, that says that the burials, they put their bones back in the ground. There were, there were some comments or notes about certain folks coming and taking remains, unfortunately, as sort of little tokens, and even certain institutions. All right, but it's unclear, and so the archaeologists did go in prior to that, having there was a public meeting, or with the public, sort of explaining what the process would be. There was outreach to kind of understand what would the public want to learn, or the advisory group that had been put together under BRC, and which is comprised of community people and folks who are in historic preservation and that kind of thing. They did not find any remains at all, and which is what they didn't expect to find, because the original grade of the site was much lower now than what it originally was. It was actually a hill. So the existing site, if you were to go there today, is not at the same grade as the site was when they removed the human remains that were there. I don't know if I've missed any other questions. Have I covered all the corners on that? That question?
I think so. Had it been built on previously? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, currently what's there is a auto repair site, shop, which has a couple of bays and a parking area, kind of tarred over parking area. And I think that's the extent of what has ever been, built there. That's it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
The next question is, in addition to the influence of white supremacy culture that tends to want to erase histories, I sense that because of a distance in time from historical events, the public tends to become desensitized towards them or depolarize them. How can memorials built today avoid or address this issue?
Well, that is the $1 million question. Memorials, if you go anywhere, you can look at the memorial downtown, you can look at memorials in a lot of different places. There, even with the African burial ground, you had a community with very different perspectives about what honoring these enslaved Africans was about. There were some people who believed that there should not be anything built on top of the burials at all, that only the sun, the sky, the moon should be over that site. And then there were those who really wanted something to mark the site and have a place of reflection. The answer, this is why I say that the engagement of the descendant community for any given site is what is critical. And that is part of the important work for any site, and engaging and trying to convey through whatever that design is, whatever happens at that site, what the significance of the site is, how to be able to tell that story, as well as to be able to command the kind of attention or elevate the history in a way that the community feels most satisfied with. And it's a challenge depending upon each site.
Thank you. The next question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add on to that real quick, that I think the conversations that we've had too about the Dyckman farmhouse and trying to reconstruct a more inclusive history. So not necessarily a separate history of enslaved people that worked on the property, but how their lives were entangled and intertwined with the Dyckmans themselves, and rethinking the spaces in the house. And this gets to Andrea's point too, with the way in which historic sites, which enslaved people lived, like plantation houses, for example, are interpreted. We talked about in the early stages of the research, kind of what the farm would have sounded like for enslaved people, or what it would have, what types of food would they have been cooking in the kitchen for the family during different periods of the year, whether it be the harvest or whether it be later on in the year. So I think that part of it too is just reconstructing a history that's more inclusive, but also encompasses the stories of enslaved people.
Can I add something?
Please.
I think also it's just important to make that history visible. I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, it was very easy to kind of ignore the history of slavery because there were no visible remnants of it. And the Mapping Slavery Project in the Netherlands has been very active in actually mapping sites of enslavement and connections with slavery and enslaved people and abolitionists and that history in total, to really make it visible to the people that history is everywhere and the connections are everywhere. And it in some ways reminds me of the project of the Stolpersteine in Germany and beyond, of the people who were taken away during the Holocaust, and they have these little stones. This artist has these little stones in front of those houses that names these people, so that you might be walking down the street and you encounter one of those stones, and it reminds you of the people who used to live there and died in the Holocaust. And I think that it's important to have these markers just to remind people of that history and to make it part of the broader landscape, so that people can't or will not forget. If people choose to be desensitized to them, I think that they can always do that. Also, if you don't have those markers, but I think those markers will make it harder to kind of forget about that history.
The next question, I think we've kind of touched on a little bit, but I'll add a little bit to what you all have said, and also all of you can feel free. It says, can you say more about the Inwood burial ground? How far along in its preservation is it? How its significance is marked, and the relationship of the burial ground to the Dyckman Farmhouse memorialization efforts. One thing I just wanted to add here is just that the burial ground present day is part of it is underneath the parking lot of a public school. And part of it is the site that Peggy was speaking about, that BRC has been researching and having conversations with the community about. We at the museum are working with the public school to fund a plaque that will kind of bring awareness to the site. I think that it's something that through all of this work that we've all been doing over the last 2 years, the principal of the school really wanted to highlight this and make sure it's a part of what they talk about at the school with the kids, as well as just something that you would see as a passerby. And in terms of the relationship to the burial ground between the Dyckman Farmhouse and us, as I said, we're working with that public school quite a bit, and we hope that in the future we will also work with them on curriculum that really speaks to the history of this site. And then we were also very heavily involved in the project with BRC and holding those community conversations. Anybody want to add anything?
No, and I would just add that that's critical. That is what the beauty of the project that BRC is working on, the fact that there was outreach to nearby and local cultural organizations and recognizing that connection between the burial ground and the Dyckman House, and trying to pull that whole story together. And that's what's really, that's what's really needed in order to in order to really support the integrity of preserving this history.
Mm-hmm. Another question is, have other uptown historic properties such as Morris Chamel Mansion and Van Cortlandt done research regarding enslaved people at those sites? What are they learning, and is it different from what you've learned at Dyckman? Ricky, I don't know if you can speak to this a little bit. As we work very closely with those two historic sites, and I know that the topic of slavery is something that they have been both trying to kind of both continuously research and bring into their programming and what they talk about with visitors. I can't speak specifically to what things they may have found. I don't know if you know anything, Ricky.
Well, I think that's definitely the next step of the Dyckman Discovered Initiative. Is we really wanted to focus on the farm and the Dyckman estate first, just to make sure that we had a really firm understanding and a foundation of what the labor routines would have looked like, the cultural influences, and the shifting definitions of freedom and slavery that we talked about a little bit earlier. But the next step is certainly expanding that and looking at this very cosmopolitan and super diverse web of communities that interacted with one another. And I think Andrea might be able to add to this too with the Hudson, the relationship with the Hudson Valley, because I think that there's so much there. There's such a rich history that we would like to add to it.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes sense. I've been working a bit with the Van Cortlandt mansion, as well as some years ago, Sylvester Manor their burial ground, African burial ground out on Long Island. And that all of these are connected. And it seems to me that it certainly makes sense to try and connect that overall story with all of these sites, sort of building an understanding of what the culture in fact was like all across the board. I just want to also add, I'd like to add that to someone's question before, as a part of helping to define how it is that we tell these stories, how it is that we memorialize these sites, and as Andrea said, making visible the invisible, that the BRC or the Inwood site, the process, it's important to say that the process that took place, aside from community listening sessions, several that were conducted under BRC, both with clients in shelters as well as community people and descendants of the African American community. There was a working advisory group that was headed up by Dyckman House and that actually pulled together ideas, and there were conversations that were had, a visioning portal that was put together so that all kinds of ideas and reflections and things, cultural components were sort of brought in to kind of create this recommendations report that went to BRC to consider as a part of their overall design. And that is a critical process. And if I were to say to anyone who was working on a project like this, that is where the rubber meets the road in terms of really seeking the insights and the wisdom of community people and descendants as a way of helping to guide the process of memorialization.
Thank you. There's one more question on here that I thought kind of might be interesting here. It says, with the Dyckman farm practically adjacent to the only bridges connecting Manhattan to the mainland, people escaping enslavement downtown would have passed the Dyckman farm on their way off the island. Do we know anything about the relationship between Dyckman's whites or blacks and the people passing on the road? I don't think we know anything specific to that question, but the location of the farmhouse certainly is an interesting one, built on a main thoroughfare, which, when at the time would have not been part of New York City, and of course now is fully part of New York City. So it definitely is something that you would have had to pass regularly. And I think that also part of that interesting history of the farmhouse, and part of a time period that we don't know as much about, is actually that kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, which doesn't necessarily speak to this question, but speaks to this as a main thoroughfare, when the farmhouse was no longer in the family's hands. And it served as a rooming house for a period of time as people were, kind of traveling down the Kingsbridge Road into what was then Manhattan, or northward out of Manhattan. So it certainly serves in a really interesting location. Yeah, Andrea, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, not necessarily about this specific location, but I do think what's important to think about when we think of enslaved people fleeing is that they oftentimes navigated these spaces very differently, right? So they might not have been using the main road. Obviously, like a bridge is a bridge, but they might have had different ways to even cross the water. We see this throughout. I mean, there were patrols throughout New York State, the colony of New York City. There were pass systems that required that Black people could prove that they were in fact legitimately navigating these spaces. And so what happens is that enslaved people oftentimes were using alleyways, back roads, like not the regular roads that the majority of the people, like free people, would have been using. So I think that is something to take into account when thinking about actually people, the way that they use these spaces would have been very different.
Add on to that, Meredith, real quick,
Yes, please.
because I think we actually have a really good historical example with the Dyckman Farmhouse. And it's definitely something that we started our project with the Dyckman Discovered Initiative, and definitely got me thinking creatively a little bit about the way in which we read historical documents, because we do have a fugitive slave ad that's connected to the Dyckman property. Will or Wiltshire was an enslaved man who escaped the property in 1765. And Jacob Dyckman published a fugitive slave ad in the New York Gazette shortly after, about a week or several days after he fled. And Will's last known location, based on this, there's only this paragraph that we have of in the newspaper, was that he had actually not fled to the Hudson Valley, but actually went to New York, to the seaport, and had been last seen near the docks area where the old governor's mansion used to be. And it's possible, because we know that Will was owned by several families prior to the Dyckmans purchasing him. He was owned by several families in the seaport itself. So his motivations for fleeing could have been more than just carving out autonomy for himself, although that most likely did play a role in it. He could have had friends, families, or a community that he had established while he lived in New York, and was trying to reach them.
Oh, I was muted. We've got a couple more here that I'll squeeze in, and then I'll let you all continue with your evening. What have you learned about enslaved people's contributions to the fabrication of the materials used to construct buildings in Upper Manhattan, and or the construction of the buildings themselves? Ricky, do you have anything you want to add to that? Or Andrea, did you want to say something?
No, this is not specifically to Upper Manhattan, but we do know that enslaved people built many or most of the houses. Schuyler Mansion is one example of that, where we know that they actually built the homes, and they also built many of the churches. When you look at the Dutch Reformed Church, there's actually the various congregants would contribute labor or materials, and in some cases they would contribute the labor of the people they enslaved, and these were the enslaved people who then could not actually worship in these churches. They were not allowed to worship in these churches, but they actually built the buildings. So throughout New York, it was very common for enslaved people to build both the materials and the buildings themselves. But I don't know about northern, anything specific about the Upper Manhattan area. But it's pretty much the same throughout the region.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that we know that there were a couple of different buildings on the property, on the Dyckman property itself. There was a cider press, there was a corn crib, there was a dairy barn as well. But one thing that I found really interesting that I think we have evidence for in the inventory records, is that because the area that is Inwood today, Meredith, you could probably fill us in a little bit more about the development of Inwood itself, but it was marshy. So they would have to build these drainage ditches along not only the sides of the road, but also the farmland itself. And that work absolutely would have been done by enslaved people who worked for the Dyckmans. And so the actual infrastructure around farming would have also been part of it.
Thank you. Okay, one last question. What activities are being planned to engage the community even more? How can you engage with community groups? How can this be linked to an educational tour for children? Excuse me. And how can Uptown re-engage with Lenape communities? One thing I'll say from the standpoint of the museum is that one of the things that we're fundraising for now is the kind of rethinking of our interpretation. What we have been doing both in, Richard has been our research assistant, in conducting a lot of this research through a grant from the New York Community Trust, which was a huge kind of kickstart to this project. We've also been engaging local artists to create site-specific art installations for the past couple of years that really speak to this history and this research, which is a great kind of entry point to having conversations with the public about the topic of enslavement. The other thing that I would say is that we are kind of in the midst of fundraising for rethinking our reinterpretation, which, is not not a simple, quick, or inexpensive project, but it's something that we're really committed to. And so we actually recently found out that we received a grant that we applied for that will, I think, help us kind of get a little bit closer to that goal. And then the part of the question about how can Uptown re-engage with Lenape communities, I can say, and Peggy, you might want to add something here as well. That was a big part of the project that we embarked upon with BRC and those community conversations. And I know that there are other organizations in the community that hold programs and events as well that kind of speak to Lenape culture.
Right. I mean, definitely the project, the Inwood Sacred Sites project was launched with initial outreach to the Lenape community, extensive actually, to get folks to participate. So there were, even on the advisory board, there were 2 members who of the Lenape community that participated. And primarily because the site, though it is situated on what was the African burial ground for Inwood, adjacent to that site, historically in a much earlier period, there were Lenape shell pits. So respecting the fact that this was a sacred or ceremonial ground that was adjacent to the African burial ground, BRC was very diligent about doing outreach to the Lenape community to include them as a part of this process. And then for the design of the building and looking at opportunities, there was a lot of emphasis on looking at opportunities for artists from the descendant communities, the various descendant communities, to participate in some way, and that's sort of in the making. So I know that BRC will be looking at that as well. And it's an important piece to the process.
Yes. Okay, thank you all. I'd like to turn it back over to Rob for some closing remarks.
This has really been a terrific conversation, and one more example of how we learn better when we learn together, because what everybody's been saying all night really sparks all sorts of ideas in my head, and I'm sure that's the same for all of you. I just want to give everybody who participated now, one more chance to sort of either add to things they've said already, raise new ideas that have just occurred to them, or something else. So why don't we start with you, Richard?
I think first I just want to thank my fellow panel members. This was a really great conversation and discussion. And I too, Rob, have had a lot of different things run through my mind during the presentation. I think one thing that is important and a big takeaway for it is how it's just to be cognizant and aware of how we craft the historical narratives and the way in which we interpret them through public programming. I think it's one thing to set out to create a more inclusive history, but I think it's important to kind of keep track of it as we move through the process of it and to follow through with different ways in which we interpret and memorialize historic sites.
Andrea, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I also would like to thank my fellow panelists, and of course you, Rob, and Meredith, and everybody else at Dyckman House. I think, to me, what really stuck with me when studying slavery in New York is that in the region, slavery slavery existed in New York for 200 years. That is about 100 years longer than it existed in Georgia. Yet when we think about slavery in North America, we tend to think of places like Georgia, right? And I think we need to really work hard to change that. Slavery was integral to New York society from 1626 to 1827 and beyond, really. And really, that was just one generation before the Civil War. So as we're having these conversations, I just think that that's important that we keep that in mind, and not just in thinking about the history, but also in how we represent that history, and how we think about the ways to really represent New York history in a more true and inclusive way. So that's just one thought I wanted to add. Thank you all.
Peggy.
Yeah, thank you, Meredith, Rob, Richard, Andrea. This was great. Any time I have an opportunity to share a little bit more and have this kind of exchange, it's really such a pleasure. I go back to my call to action. Andrea mentioned something that's near and dear to me. Georgia history. I'm a native of Southwest Georgia, and I grew up around in Albany, Georgia, where there are tons of plantations that exist. And I used to go onto those plantations looking for African burial grounds, which are there unmarked. And my call to action is really, at the end of the day, connecting all of this history, because slavery was a global construct. And it impacted us. And I know that we tend to sort of focus on our various little communities, but I'm working on a site that's on the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. And the community there deals with that very differently. And they kind of looked at me to kind of say, well, why are you here? What does it have to do with you? Well, I'm a descendant of enslaved people. And I can tell you, this is my history. And so it's places like Noonan, Georgia, Albany, Georgia, all of these other rural places that ultimately have to and do connect to New York's history, and to help tell that story. And I think it's time that we take these, the Inwood Cemetery and the cemetery downtown and the, Van Cortlandt Manor, all of this history was happening, many times at the same time, and sort of connecting those dots so that people understand the enormity and the weight of what this was about as a part of telling that story. So that's my call to action, and helping these rural areas to sort of connect into this larger database as well.
Let me just say, as Manhattan Borough historian, how immensely gratifying it has been to participate in this conversation, which is local. It's grounded in Inwood, but it's hardly parochial, right? We've reached from Inwood out into the city, to the region, to the state, to the rest of the world, and we've shown interconnections. And just one thing I'd add, and in relation to what Andrea said about the length of slavery in the state of New York, right? And how long we have had slavery here. Similarly, Americans' notions of the frontier are basically shaped largely by images of the Western Plains, right? But the frontier in New York State lasted far longer than the frontier on the Western Plains. Whether you think of the frontier as a zone of intercultural contact or a battleground, New York State's frontier is formative in lots of ways, and we need to look at that also as well as a huge piece of history that's sitting in our backyard. Secondly, another thing that I just love about the presentation is the way it engages both history and commemoration, which are closely bound up together. And y'all did it in such a constructive way, because the historical discussion is taking place while we discuss commemoration. Neither is tacked on to the other, but the discussions of both energize and inform each other. And I just think that's great. And I'm so pleased to have worked with you all tonight. And with that, I'll give it back to Meredith.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was really a great discussion, and so happy to have all of you virtually here. So just hope everyone attending enjoyed the conversation tonight. We hope that you'll consider making a donation to help enable us to continue to offer our free programming. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. I also would like to remind you that this is the third in a series of 5 in our Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation series. Join us here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. here on Zoom. Be sure to register through the links that were provided in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. We will see you here next week, September 15th at 6 p.m. for a long time coming, the archaeology and history of the Native and African American community in Setauket, New York, with Dr. Christopher Matthews. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.